Good afternoon, team. Wanted us to regroup from our discussions that we started back in March about the new Department of Labor Form T-1. And we left off talking about who may need to file a T-1 and noted potential filers are trusts for which a labor union is interested, and that union is a current LM2 filer. And before we talk about who's responsible for filing the T-1 or the record keeping and technology challenges in preparing this form and what it may cause for the organizations, Dave, how are these trusts defined, and can you give us some examples?
Sure, Brian, I'm happy to do that. If an LM2 filer goes to question 10 on their LM report, it asks a question about whether or not the union created or participated in the administration of a trust or other fund that provides benefits to members or beneficiaries. And so the nature of the Form T1 is to focus on entities that meet that test. Now, it's easy for us to say it, but it's another thing to understand, well, what the heck does the Department of Labor really mean? And are unions really answering that question correctly to start off with? And our experience suggests that some unions are getting that right, but many of them are not. And so let's talk about the entities themselves. This conceptually answers yes for pension funds, health and welfare funds, apprenticeship funds, scholarship funds. Some unions have insurance companies or credit unions or health plans, federal health plans actually, that they sponsor, and all of those would meet the definition of a trust. But so that's the big population. The target of the Form T1 has more to do with not just does a union participate, but does the union control that trust? And control is really defined by two measures. There's a management control and there's a financial control. And so what the T1 requires is if the union, either by themselves or in conjunction with another group of unions, appoint more than 50% of those charged with governance or the board of directors or trustees, then they would meet that test and they'd have to report. Or if the union provides more than 50% of the funding, and here's the kicker, is the government defines contributions that comes into the entity through a collective bargaining agreement as being sourced from the union. So if there's a CBA which drives contributions into one of these entities, it would be considered a trust. And if that represents more than half of the receipts, it would have to file a T1. So to your question about, who has to file this form, it's interesting because the T1 focuses on the trust itself, but the trust doesn't do the filing. The labor union actually does the filing. The trust is the organization that has to provide data to the labor union for purposes of filing, and that's where things can get a little bit messy for the labor leaders.
So that's quite I'm sensing this isn't your first time of going over that definition, Dave. That's quite a handful of rules and who files it. And I guess that the next point, Jason, you work with unions that file LM2s, and certainly the trust that Dave talks about does not. What are your thoughts about the impact that this may have?
Yeah, so I've taken a look at the T1, and to me, it looks very, very similar to an LM2. So if you're an LM2 filer, you'd be pretty familiar right off the bat with what's required of a T1. The issue is the union traditionally doesn't have this information, right? So they're going to have to go to the trust and get the information from them. And we know how hard it is sometimes to just do an LM2. Think about if that's not your data, you've got to go elsewhere to get it. So I was talking to Wally about, hey, what are some of the best ways? What are some of the easiest ways for a union that's in this situation, an LM2 filer that has some trusts where they have some T1s they need to file? How can they most easily get the data, and also, as important, get it in the format needed to easily complete a T1?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I mean, I think that part's really interesting because the data challenge is you have multiple forms of data coming from various different organizations and folks that may be technically challenged or not. And so you have a variety of information that may come to you, and yet you as an organization still have to try and meet, GAP compliance, FASB rules, Department of Labor rules to try and get those forms out the door. So one of the quickest ways is to try and determine a way to aggregate your data and get it inside of a single system. And there's, many systems out there, like the all-in-ones like NetSuite, et cetera, that will allow you to pull that information into it, and then be able to quickly and easily and seamlessly pull out expense report data on particular elements. I need all the expenses in a date range, et cetera. And those kind of tools make it a lot easier for someone to track through and adhere to the compliance rules.
Well, I tell you, Wally, you mentioned getting your arms around this data, and that seems to me to be the biggest hotspot here. And that, coming out of this COVID-19 situation, a lot of unions and their related entities were kind of caught, I guess, flat-footed is really the right word. They really weren't prepared to do that. And this is all about grabbing data. How do we get that information electronically? And I know that you've had experience helping organizations do that. But it seems to me they've got to approach this with the mindset that they've got to learn to do business a different way. They have to figure out how to get away from these manual systems. We enter 9 things over here and 8 things in this system and 5 things over in this system, and try to come up with something that puts it all in one place. Is that pretty much what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I really like that analogy. Wrapping your arms around technology is your ally and not your enemy. And I think a lot of folks, when you're first starting to wrap your mind around getting to these T1 forms, traditionally what you've done is just put more people on it. So, we've got to get this out. Let's add 5 people to this task. With technology as your ally, and by grabbing that data early and really understanding how that data comes into your system, and then allowing yourself to put triggers and checks and balances in place to manage your internal controls, and ultimately be able to deliver on the T1, in which we're talking about, the LM2, or any of the other forms that these organizations would have to put forward is really the key.
So this really isn't just a T1 optimization. It would really, having a modern system would help your LM, it would help your internal controls. It would help for really all facets of your union operations.
Really helps ease the burden of having disconnected systems. As I run around and do assessments today, there's a membership system, there's a payroll system, there's a debits and credits system, and somehow an organization has to tie all these things together, timestamp it, only certain expenses go into certain reports, etc. And all of these elements are causing these folks a lot of grief to try and get those reports out. By tying that all in together and bringing that information into a single system, they can then get closer to getting technology as their ally and not fear it. Really, truly start to embrace how the technology will help them get those reports out.
And would that allow me to keep up my operations without having to step foot in the office on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, exactly right. The modern systems like NetSuite can be run from your iPhone, your tablets. If you're Android, it can be run on the Android phone. So you really do not need to be inside the 4 walls of your office as it exists today.
As we've been discussing this with a lot of clients, and like, the big question we usually get is, so what's my due date? And I know that there's not an easy answer depending upon what the year end of the trust or labor orgs, but anyone want to dive a little deeper into that?
Sure. Yeah, it is pretty complicated, unfortunately. One of the key things to keep in mind is if the trust that you're responsible for filing for, if its year end is within 90 days of your union's year end, then you file for the prior year of the trust. So they do that to give you, they understand, the DOL understands you need to file your LM. That's going to be a big enough lift up on its own. And to do this T1 is a whole nother deal. So to do that, they need to afford you additional time. So that's really the big thing. If the trust year end is within 90 days of the union's year end, you get to file the prior year, which means you have a whole nother year to pull the information together.
Yeah. So I love, I can't wait till Dave gets back on when we're speaking of technology. I know that he's in the middle of an upgrade, and I would like to say I miss him not being on the call, but it's good he's taking a little break from it.
Nice.
Yeah. So clearly the opportunity goes so much beyond just preparing the data for the form right now, as it is just looking at the entire infrastructure of your organization and how systems, as you said, Wally, how do they talk? Does my dues collection and my payables and what I need, even if you look not only for the T1 but the LM2, Jason, I know that you worked on a project just recently where there was a lot of manual manipulation, and and they sort of upgraded their system, and it's going to help them greatly in the LM2, let alone the T1. And so perhaps not looking at this in a vacuum of what do I need for the T1, but saying, what do I need for the T1, but what's also my pain points technology wise or system talking wise, that we can also sort of take this opportunity now to revisit. And as our workforce may continue, to be remotely for a while, or other opportunities may arise just in teleworking and everything else beyond, as we go forward. So it looks like there's a lot of opportunity that also, and potential that goes along with this T1
For sure.
preparation.
I think one of the big efficiencies is the kind of the concept of when you process a transaction, only do it once, right? Only touch it once. And the way a lot of unions are doing it now for their LM2, they process the initial transaction, then year end comes around and they need to say, hey, how does this get reported in the LM? And then they have to kind of pick up that transaction again and move it around or put it in a different bucket to satisfy LM2 compliance. And Wally and I have talked a lot about how we can cut out that second step, and the first time the transaction is processed, put it where it needs to be for the financial statements, put it where it needs to be for the LM2. And if I'm a union officer and I want to see a certain report and see where these credit card transactions went or see what dues are looking like, I should be able to do that at the push of a button. And those are some of the things that Wally's shown me with NetSuite or with a modern, what we would call ERP system. It really affords you those opportunities that we couldn't really do before.
I like that, Jason, a lot, because you touch on 2 points, and one is on process, and the other one is on having an executive or a manager be able to approve and see. So on the process side, imagine if our end users could access information from their phones, from remote computers over the web, and be able to easily enter in their expenses appropriately. And then from an approval standpoint, quickly and easily, the manager could get that expense and approve the expense for being paid out, etc. All that's really neat in terms of the operational side, but on a reporting side, I can actually take that expense and report on that expense in multiple ways. I could have an expense report with 5 different expenses. Each of those 5 don't necessarily need to be in the LM2 report, so I don't have to take every line that was on that expense report. It could be segmented by expense type, by timing, by resource, etc. And all those things could be factored in. You could even, for example, take a list of the top 5 vendors and be able to report on the top 5 vendors per expense, detailed, show me everybody's expense report that went to this particular company, for example. So, and now all of a sudden you get a lot of detail there.
What if I have like my union has a specific organizing campaign and I want to start tracking things related to that action? Am I able to add that whenever I want?
Like that a lot, because I can now have somebody that actually writes the expense report to a particular company for an overall program or campaign that they're running. And so all of those then can be reported on. I could report in its entirety on that campaign, or I then could take parts of that campaign and segment it out in a modern system. Wow. Really easy to do that.
That's cool.
I had a client recently that has overhauled and upgraded their accounting software ERP system, and we're doing a lot about talking about available resources in technology and software, and it's all really, really great. One thing that also struck me about this client is that there's also this part about like the training of their people and getting additional resources and training and helping them make the switch from the spreadsheets that they know so well and work with so much because it's just familiar and it's reliable to them, and then showing them how these new systems, while there's a little bit of a learning curve, can really help with that reporting in significant ways. And, you know, I know they've benefited greatly, and they've been able to use the new software really well, and it's helping them with all this stuff. So I don't know, a little success story that was really cool.
I love hearing stories like that help optimize staffing and repurposing folks in an area that maybe they would learn. So it's amazing to me who has the ability and the capacity to pick up on some of these modern technologies, and they learn all about it, and they can then free up a whole bunch more time to dedicate more effort and to the membership or whomever else in that organization that they need to provide time for. So very, very cool to be able to optimize staffing that way.
For sure. Hey, Wally, I have another question. One thing that I'm seeing pretty frequently now, and as we're kind of dealing with the COVID-19 situation, a lot of our union clients, they had really robust internal controls. They had a really specific approval process when it came to approving expenses and writing checks. And as places have been closed, New York City was shut down, you couldn't get in buildings. We saw it all over the country. People weren't able to get in the office. So they were really scrapping all these great procedures and controls they had in place just to kind of keep the business going, just to keep the union running. And I think the answer is yes, but is there a way that a modern ERP can handle an approval process? So if I'm an officer of a union and I look at every bill before it goes out, can I sign off on that on my phone or on a laptop from my house or anywhere and keep the business going without having to step foot in the office?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right about the controls, because remember, we're not that far off from some folks signing a piece of paper and running down to the principal's office, so to speak, and get the signature, and okay, now we're good to go. You know, and now we had people's signatures, and that was our general controls and our ideas of that. For the IT side, the ability to be able to digitally sign. So what that means is Jason puts his an expense report, I'm his approver, I approve it. That'll be digitally signed and auditable. And then I can track that through. And then if Jason puts in a $5,000 expense report and I only have the ability to approve $2,500, I can't approve it, and it bypasses me, and off it goes to Brian, who now can approve it. So those things that were before tough to challenge and track through are right out of the box with these modern systems as you build out your expense reports.
So the system handles it automatically?
Yeah, it handles that. We have to put some numbers in. You know, Wally can approve 2,500, Brian can approve up to 10,000. Brian's boss approves more than that. And then if it bypasses that expense report, bypasses all that, it just automatically goes to the right person to approve. And interestingly, CCs the other folks along the way. So if it was above my approval rate, I'd still get it, even though Brian's approving. That way I can still see it, touch it, understand it, and look at it.
Great. Just switching gears a little bit, certainly the technology and it presents a huge challenge and opportunity, as we said, but, we talked about who needs to file it and the trust. Are there any specific exceptions for which, they may have fit this definition? So I'll ask this of you, Ashley. They may fit the definition that Dave talked about, but they do have certain exceptions that they may not need to file?
Yes, there are quite a few exceptions, actually. And then additional complexities with the filing is, so for example, if this organization, this trust, or is a political action committee, they're not required. If they are already required by federal state guidelines to have publicly available reporting, they're not required. If the trust is already filing a 5500, they're exempted from T1 needing to be filed. If it's a credit union, they are exempted. So that's a couple of the exemptions. There are more. It's interesting because if you have a trust that has historically not filed a 5500, they can actually choose to start filing one instead of doing the T1. So there's options available through that 5500 route for the trust that would be applicable.
And that would be like a training and apprenticeship fund, most commonly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I've seen. The other thing I thought was interesting, I think that there are going to be situations where there are multiple unions for the same trust that fit this managerial domination test, right? And so, if you don't mind, Brian, just take a second to mention if you're in a situation like that, if the unions want to coordinate, they can all the filing can be done by one union on behalf of others, as long as it's acknowledged and, you know, included in the filing. If there isn't a collaboration, you know, of coordination of that work, then each union will have to file their own T1. But that is an option for those unions that are able to coordinate in that way. So yeah, does that answer enough of your question? I could go through the detailed exceptions with you, Brian, but I thought I just hit maybe the top main ones.
Yeah, no, that was interesting, and I know that on that last topic you brought up, you know, we talk about so much coordination between the union and the trust, and sometimes this coordination between unions. I know a few of us actually worked on separate unions that actually had a trust in common, and so it was through that sort of coordination of effort that we were able to. Frankly, I think if we weren't on both sides of it, they would have both probably went about preparing their own form. And so there definitely is coordination on a lot of different sides.
So you're saying multiple unions could file a T1 for the same trust?
Yes.
Yeah.
In theory.
Yeah.
I wonder if they didn't make the same filing, what the DOL would say about that.
Yeah. And on the flip side, as you know, as we've been talking about, you know, in some of that scenario, the communication is even less than that, where instead of both unions filing for the trust, neither union does, because they assume the other union's filing. And so, you know, to me, it goes even beyond the unions. I think it's bringing in someone who understands the rules, understands the T1 process. And as Dave says, you know, you look on the LM2 of who your related organizations are, and just take a deeper dive even beyond the LM2, say here are where we have interests at, and bring in a professional who knows the T1, understands the filing. And I think that definitely from a regulatory perspective helps. And so there's a lot of coordinations. There's technology coordinations, there's coordination between organizations and your trusted advisors and your professionals as well, coordinating best there.
And I could say I can also see if you had the right trusted advisor in that situation, they could help with that coordination piece, because it's such a new and awkward filing, you know, especially as in this initial phases while everybody's trying to figure it out. To be able to lean on, you know, like kind of an unbiased third party might be able to help some of the inter-union communication that maybe historically hasn't been all that frequent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's good. And you know, I know that we definitely covered what we were looking for today. And as we're all out speaking and talking with clients and prospects, you know, more questions are coming in. And I think that I'm in a process of sort of coordinating, because there's some themes that we're seeing. And so I want to get out another meeting invite so we can sort of catch up on a few of what we're seeing, sort of questions coming into us that maybe we can help others who may not know the answers to them. And I think that we'll schedule another meeting to sort of regroup on that piece right now. But I think we've definitely covered a lot of the challenges we have today. And I know the biggest question does relate to, you know, beyond the upfront is, does it impact me or does it not impact me? But it's the middle piece, and it goes so much beyond, as we said, just preparing the T1. It's how can I just take my accounting system, my technology to the next level. And frankly, the T1 itself may not cost anything else if you're upgrading your systems and you just incorporate it in, because, as you said, Wally, things can flow so naturally that way. Yeah. And that the T1 really can basically come down to a click of a few buttons to generate the data. And like you said, Jason, there's no doubt that when unions are filing an LM2, that data collection and getting the form to balance and the more manual components, the more challenging it is. And you stack all that time year after year after year together, that really adds up to a huge drain and a lot of stress and anxiety on the members of the organizations too, who's all involved in filing that, and added fees for professionals to help prepare it too.
Certainly.
So, well, thank you all for your time. And like I said, I'll regroup. I'll send out an invite. We'll get back together and sort of see what feedback we're getting and talk a little bit more about that in more depth. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
See you later.